When you look back at your journey, can you take us to that moment where you first had to choose between following your passion or staying with the safe, stable path?
Yeah, I remember it really clearly, actually. So this was back when I was working at Point 72, which is a pretty recognized hedge fund in New York City, and I was 28. And I always had this history of entrepreneurship, but never really dove in 100%. But when I turned 28, there's something that just flickered in my brain. And the whole regret minimalization approach that Jeff Bezos mentions very often really started to eat at me. Meaning, if I were 80 years old and I look back at my life, would I regret not ever going 100% in on a startup? And the answer for me was a resounding yes. And that was such an angst inside of me that I knew that it was the right time for me to choose the path that is less traveled and the path that is riskier, which is entrepreneurship. And even though I did enjoy my work at Point 72, it was just this feeling, this thing in my gut that told me I would always regret not having dove in. It was then I reached out to my now co-founder, Steven, and started discussing ideas with him. And as things become more solid, we started building our first company together. But I hadn't left my work just yet. I hadn't left Point 72. So I was building on the side, but it was that moment I realized that it was probably there and now that I had to make a decision to go into the startup world on that.
Yeah, well, hearing people choose passion over stability sounds very inspiring. But once you made that decision to follow your passion, what truly comes next? Was it a smooth ride, or did you ever hit some bumps along the way earlier on?
Yeah, I mean, the beginning of a startup is never smooth, especially when you're trying to balance it with a full-time job. So I think now more and more entrepreneurs are building on the side. And once they get traction, that's really when they start diving in 100%. And I think it's actually more viable than ever now with AI to be able to build on the side so that you de-risk the whole process of
Mm,
going from a full-time employee to a full-time founder.
mm,
And I will say, even if you de-risk that process, there's another sacrifice, which is time and health. So I was getting probably 3 hours of sleep a night for at least 3 months straight. And it was
mm.
incredibly painful, but that's the trade-off you make, right? If you do want to transition from that stability to the risk of having your own startup and working 100%, you need to give up something, and that's typically sleep, right?
Mhm.
But then you're at a much better position to go full time once you got a little traction with your startup and have some MRR to rely on.
Well, talking about all those trade offs, I have a forward question for you. Was it worth it?
Yes, it's definitely worth it. I mean, look, that 3 months honestly was kind of like hell, not gonna lie. But now it's much better, right? Like my mental health and my just general level of happiness is
Mhm.
the highest it's ever been. I'm not saying that I don't work a lot still. I still definitely work a lot, but it's just where I want to be and what I want to achieve. Like I feel like now I'm on the path to doing so rather than before, which would have avoided it completely.
Yeah, well, you started your own company, Chargeblast, in your late 20s. It's a time when a lot of people feel pressure to have it all figured out. Did you ever feel like you were behind or that starting over would put you at a disadvantage?
Honestly, no. I mean, there's a lot, especially with all these big founder names like Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and Elon Musk that started their entrepreneurship journey like really early on. I think there's a lot of value to actually waiting and getting some experience in the real world before jumping in 100%. So, my career has really spanned across strategy, operations, and finance. And that really gave me the ability to wear multiple hats really
Mhm.
effectively and to be able to get Charge Blast from 0 to 100 much faster than otherwise. Right. So I wouldn't say like I felt like I was starting over or being put at a disadvantage. I would actually say like when I made that jump full time into Charge Blast, it felt like the right next step for me. Almost like a career, honestly. It felt like the next career for me. And I think that's really important. And I think that a lot of founders shouldn't necessarily rush it. Gain that
Mhm.
experience that's necessary just to be a good operator, and you'll do much better founding a company than otherwise.
Yeah, I just wanted to add. So I read somewhere just last week that a lot of business owners or CEOs are people who are fresh off university, very young. They want to go straight to becoming a CEO and they never go through that path of, climbing the ladder from the very, from the lowest part of a corporate setup, which doesn't really help them become the best operators of their own companies just because they don't have the experience. So I feel like it's more of a societal pressure for people to have it all figured out at a very young age, which isn't really true because you're right. You definitely need all those experiences first and then you can figure it out later.
Yep, exactly. And at the end of the day, right, maybe you don't need those experiences really early on because you are the whole company. But then when you
Mhm.
start scaling and you need to hire more and more people, having that experience is really critical. And honestly, especially if you're selling B2B, understanding other people, who you're selling to and where they sit in the corporate structure, the decision making levels that they have is really useful as well. So I would never encourage anyone just to dive into it because they feel pressure
Mhm.
like, oh man, I'm getting into my late 20s. Look at all these founders who started, in their early 20s. It's definitely worthwhile building a network, building the skill set before you jump in because even though someone might start earlier, you're going to get to the same place much faster thanks to your experience.
For founders, especially, the tension between passion and stability seems to show up a lot. Why do you think this conflict is such a central part of the founder's path?
Well, I think it's really just a central part of human nature. Humans, in essence, they're not really risk prone, right? If you think about our basic human instincts, it's survival. And survival often means to de risk rather than take risk, right? So it's not necessarily just like a founder's problem or dilemma. It's everyone's problem and dilemma. And I wouldn't even call it a problem. It's just the way it is, right? Exceptional entrepreneurs and founders, they're the ones that can really balance risk and reward. And I think that by understanding like what the risk you're taking are and being able to either use that as fuel, right, is really important. So I'll give you an example. So when I left Point 72, I was making a very good salary, right? Like you make a pretty high amount of money when you're in the hedge fund world. And when I left to pursue Charge Blast full time, I had rent to pay in New York, which is very expensive. There's a certain lifestyle that, I was accustomed to, right? Which is also like not that cheap, right?
Mhm.
And then you have that pressure. You have that pressure of, oh my goodness, if I don't succeed, what's going to happen? Right? If I don't succeed, am I even going to be able to find another job? Because it's not
Mhm.
easy to get back into the hedge fund world, right?
Mhm.
It's not easy to go back from being a founder to anything. So that pressure really drove me to make sure I succeeded, meaning I put in many, many hours of work. I put
Mhm.
in all my effort when it came to closing deals. And I used all my capacity to figure out how to make Charge Blast work, period.
Mhm.
Right. Using that pressure as fuel is really important. And not everyone can do that. And that's okay. But understanding that you really can't sit on both sides of stability and founder success is important because you'll have to go in all in at some point, and going all in is really what brings you to the next level of founding, the next level of entrepreneurship.
That's right. Well, given this, I know you kind of touch upon having or using that pressure to pursue your passion. But there are people who have this question lingering in their minds when they want to start something. Do you think passion is a luxury or is it a necessity for building something sustainable or stable?
That's a great question. I think passion is oftentimes a luxury, right? Not everyone can afford to take that risk. But passion is also a necessity because even though you may not be able to afford to take that risk, people with passion typically figure out how to do so. And it's typically in the form of sacrifice.
Mhm.
I tell this to a lot of my employees, but in life, there's many important things, but you can typically break it down, I think, into like 5 aspects. You have health, you have sleep, you have friends, you have family, and then you have your loved one. 5 things. And
Mhm.
career, sorry. Now, you can't do all of it at once. So you can only focus on typically 3. Now, if you do want to do everything at once, you'll typically give up sleep.
Mhm.
And that's the way for people who may not have the luxury of just dropping everything and have that security or backup plan to go into entrepreneurship, right? What they need to do is really figure out, am I passionate enough to give up on hours of sleep in my life
Mhm.
for at least, the first 6 months, right? That's
Yeah.
typically, not everyone has the privilege to do so, but if you have enough passion, you'll figure it out typically. That's what I think.
And just to close this off, for anyone out there who's facing the same fork in the road, having to choose between passion and stability, what's that one piece of advice you'd want to leave them with?
Yeah. So I would really focus on one thing, which is build an MVP and test it out as quickly as possible, meaning can you get revenue from it while you're still working a full-time job? And that typically requires sacrifice of sleep, right? But if you're really passionate about it and if you're really fit for the founder life, you'll give up that sleep. Because let me tell you, even after you go in full time, you still need to give up sleep, right? It's just the way it is. And if you're not willing to give up sleep, well, then honestly, like probably being a founder may not be the right fit. So, but really just assess that and understand who you are and whether it makes sense for you to go down this path or not.
Amazing. Thank you. That's a wrap on today's episode. If this resonated with you, share it with someone facing a big decision. And don't forget to subscribe for more behind the scenes journey from the top. Thanks for watching. Get to know the CEO.
Thank you.